please type your answers to the icebreakers in the chat box and use the Q&A box to type any questions you might have about the webinar or presentation there. And Fiona and I will ask your questions during the Q&A period and throughout the presentation as well. Or alternatively, you can raise your hand and ask your questions live to Dr. Ellis and Dr. Wood.
And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Adam Ellis. He was named a 2016 Vanier Scholar, my apologies, in support of his doctoral project, Conceptualizing Urban Warfare in Canada, exploring the relationship between trauma, PTSD, and gang violence. Doctoral work is inspired by his own lived experience within the gang subculture. His research is situated within a participatory decolonizing framework. He's worked on several research projects focusing on the relationship between trauma and urban violence. He has provided consultation on mental health and criminal justice related issues with a variety of public and private institutions. Adam is currently leading the design and implementation of Toronto's first street organization transformation model. He is currently developing his first edited text called Thug Criminology. Adam is the co-director of the Street Trauma Institute, an international research hub focusing on urban marginality, community, interpersonal trauma, and violence. He is also designing and implementing a number of community programs to disrupt street-level related violence in the Greater Toronto area. Dr. Michael Wood Jr. is a practicing scholar of management and holds a BS in criminal justice, an MS in business management information technology, and a PhD in management education. Additionally, Michael is internationally recognized subject matter expert in policing after a highly decorated career in the Baltimore Police Department and United States Marine Corps. Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So unfortunately, I only can see this slide.
Yeah, we can't see your screen just yet.
Apologize.
Thanks. There we go. I think it's about to go. Perfect. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. So before we begin, we just wanted to let you know that this presentation is more of is driven by stories and narratives about experiences in the streets and Dr. Wood's experience as a former police officer. So feel free to send questions our way through the chat space. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll also have time to do a Q&A. So we're open to asking questions as we go. Originally, I was approached by the team to have a conversation about gangs and how young people navigate the streets. I've been working with my colleague Michael for about a year now, and I thought it was an important addition to the conversation to explore how the police and street youth interact in this space and the impact each other have, and basically what we call the game in the streets. So this presentation is called Both Sides of the Wire, a conversation with a former street soldier and police veteran about urban violence. So in the opening of this discussion today, I've heard the term gang used about 20 times. I think this is always the elephant in the room. And I know it's a term that's kind of ingrained not only in the academic literature, but also within government and those working with so-called gang populations. But, you know, before we can have a conversation about anything, we need to kind of disrupt this myth about the gang. And, you know, I provided a tongue-in-cheek picture of two females throwing up gang signs. But it really drives to this idea of what is a gang, who gets to be a gang, right? And what are we buying into this kind of myth and ideology around the gang? We know as criminologists that the term gang is a social construct and it carries pretty negative connotations with it. So opening this conversation, and one of the reasons I wanted to bring Michael in is because you've had this past experience as a police officer, but also as a person that's been a part of this system that's kind of created these ideologies and these ideas about these young people in these neighborhoods. So I'm just wondering from the outstart, Michael, how, when you were a police officer, how did you see young people in the streets, and how was this gang, the term gang, used within in the system?
You know, it feels even funny to answer it, Adam, because I feel like it's kind of common knowledge that everybody kind of knows how these things are done. So when I first went onto the streets, and this is in Baltimore where The Wire is, it has drawn its fame and everybody is used to seeing it. Well, growing up in the outskirts of Baltimore, that is kind of the mentality you had going in. You see gangs the same way you see them on television, and the way they are presented on cops and movies and the radio and the kind of normal cultural things that we see going on. And The Wire is is probably like the most beneficial look, that gives the most credence to the common idea of what we would see as a gang member being out there. But in those suburbs, one thing that it kind of sticks around now, and I would say it's less racial and more cultural, but there's this idea that police are in place to keep everything within the city, keep the gang things happening in the city, because these are bad people who just shouldn't be coming out into the county, that need to be policed and need to have like that heavy hand of the tough cop. So I went to Baltimore because I came from the Marine Corps, and I felt like going to a lot of other cities would be kind of doing punk police work. And I wanted to go to where all the action was, and action in society certainly meant that you would be chasing guns and you would be chasing gang members, and you would be working hard to get into these units where you could go after more gang members. So if you want to start just from where my police career started off, when I was a patrol officer, mostly you hear about the gang members as being like the suspects and who you're going to go after. But more importantly, your career is based upon putting these who has been identified as gang members, and it's a very I don't know what the right word would be. I think right now I'm just going to go with ambiguous way that they determine who's in a gang. It's literally like an officer who's assigned to do gang work is paid to create a list of people who are gang members, and then you go after them with enhanced penalties and enhanced resources with this idea that you're going to be connected to violence because these are the people that are on the gang list. So you have these identified gang members, and you use the state force to go after them and get those arrest stats so that you can climb within units. And that's exactly what I did. I made hundreds of arrests on the streets, and that was able to climb me up in the ranks, where I guess ironically ended up being so deep in the major case squad investigating a particular gang that my perceptions of gangs really began to change when I got very deep into their investigations.
So at the core, I guess, as a police officer, you really believed that there was a thing, an entity called the gang.
Yeah, I mean, it feels, now I would kind of really understand that there's a lot of nuance to this, but at the time, you just have these people that are labeled as being this gang member who they work together, and they cause problems in the neighborhood and bring the neighborhood down. And they're the enemy not only to the neighborhood locally, but to society broader. So not only are you serving the citizens of Baltimore by going after the gang, you're serving the citizens outside of Baltimore and America as a whole by kind of quashing this idea that it's even possible. In Baltimore, one thing that's very different is you will not see people going around wearing flags and showing signs of gangs, because as soon as we see that sign, we are coming after you with an extremely heavy hand.
And it's interesting having this conversation with you, because for myself growing up, I don't think I've ever heard the term gang at the dinner table, or I never heard the term gang within the circle of people I grew up with. You know, we were just individuals that were going through some hard times, and we viewed each other more as families and as brothers, right? And it's just it's interesting, this term gang is situated so it's almost like an anchor in how we understand these young people in the streets. But in reality, the young people in the streets really don't see themselves this way up until a point, until they're told that they're actually a gang, right? That's been my experience. It wasn't until society's intervention and they were like, yeah, you're a gang. And then you're like, okay, maybe I have to live up to that, right? In grade one,
like being called a criminal, it feels
right.
like it's the same thing. It's like it's a label coming from the outside that once it's instilled enough, it's like you have to live up to it because there's no other option.
Right. And I just want to throw this out there because, you know, I hear it so much, and it's so problematic within the literature on street youth, or street organizations, as Brotherton calls them from the U.S. It's just once we categorize these group of youth, it's like we constantly just see them one way as criminal. And I'm hoping from this conversation today that we can kind of shift some minds who are fully entrenched in these ideas, and maybe some who have more liberal thinking, even challenge those perspectives. So I would say that's a great starting point as we jump off and say, let's move away from this kind of gang narrative and just see these young people as youth, and youth that have been harmed by society. So another kind of big question, and it's been answered a lot within criminology and sociology literature, is why do youth join organizations that use violence? And we took the approach of trying to understand this as both of our trajectories, and how maybe two people who start in similar situations can go in totally different directions, but end up in the same place, which is the game, the neighborhood. And we, you know, I always think it would be even more interesting if you were the police officer who was policing me from my neighborhood, and maybe that's the next stage of things. But we start from here. It's like, what? So why join? So I guess from my perspective, and it was interesting, I was just reading the other day. I grew up in two primary communities in the city of Toronto. One is called the Junction, and the other Regent Park, and two vastly different neighborhoods. But I came across this gentleman's research from York University on Toronto gangs in the 1940s, and he had pointed out that there was 3 or 4 primary gangs during the 1940s that were identified that were causing issues in the streets. One of them was the Junction Gang, so it was actually a gang that has a historical context, where I came from, where I was born. And the slide on the right, interestingly, is information gathered by, I believe, 2 or 3 young people who are not academics. And it's interesting, when I look at these kind of crime maps, I trend towards relying on the information from the people who are actually living it and the people who are actually studying it. But there's kind of this huge growth in kind of what they identify as gangs. This map has shootings in it and stuff, but it was just interesting to me to see that there's been this rapid growth in kind of our ideas of gangs. And I don't know if that comes from actually street organizations forming, or is it just from more and more of the labeling of these neighborhoods and individuals from authorities. So it's just interesting to me that I've had this long history. I grew up in a neighborhood that on one side we had the bikers, on the other side we had the Italian mafia, and in the middle was us. And then surrounding us we had kind of cultural neighborhoods in transition, neighborhoods experiencing poverty, etc. And we all came together and played in the same space. My own trajectory, I had kind of this original family situation in the streets. So a lot of my family members were involved in the streets or street life. And that's where kind of I started to open my eyes to perhaps this was a trajectory that I was also going to go on. Sorry. So Michael, did you want to just comment on kind of your background in the city?
Yeah, so one of the things we can probably answer more questions in detail about later on, though, is when you're talking about that definition of gang, what would that definition of gang be? And as I grew further in my investigation of gangs and working in the major case squad, this is where I kind of started to question. We can just say, let's give pause to the gang definition and what we're really calling a gang and the separations of that. So the thing I want to say is I grew up in a poor neighborhood. I grew up in Section 8 housing, getting through with a single mother. I was a latchkey kid in the 90s with a racially blind society that I still kind of miss a lot. And I lived in a very mixed neighborhood. And so we didn't have racial tensions. We had this whole poverty and inequality thing that we looked at, the lower class drama. And there's this narrative and this long history in America of how do you get out of being the lower class. And one reason why American policing is very Irish based is because they were considered the minority, the oppressed minority at the time in the country, and held into lower classes. So the way out of that is to join the police department and continue your service and to kind of go through that way. And this is a big gang, essentially. It is a group of people who are going out there and using violence to achieve an agenda that pretty much will fit anything that you're going to make a gang definition of. And the only way you cannot include law enforcement is if you say something like, unless the majority of the population agrees, or unless you're talking about police departments itself. And I really began to feel that when I was looking at the neighborhood gang kids that were going through, they're selling drugs, they're getting up early in the morning. I wasn't getting up early in the morning, so maybe they definitely have more work ethic than I did. But they're getting up early, they have these stressors, they're trying to make life work. But they live in this environment that's surrounded by violence and thus brings more police, more inequality, and the over-policing, which ends up kind of painting everything in a very different perspective that when I was watching it in covert surveillance and saw it without my presence there, without my limited perspective changing the entire perception and behavior of the neighborhood, I saw kids who were acting very much like I did growing up. I just didn't have the police hounding me down at every turn. And I followed this societally approved way of going out and using violence, which was to join the Marine Corps at 17, essentially be a mercenary and fulfill the definition of a gang, unless you're talking about the government and majority approved kind of context of using this violence and achieving these goals. And I went in and was a mercenary for 4 years and came out and ended up continuing to be a person that is a mercenary on the streets for the police department for Baltimore. Now, I'm going to provide a lot of nuance to that and say, hey, you need those people at certain times and in certain places. But how we're societally distinguishing these things, what I ended up seeing was people who were trying to survive, trying to protect their neighborhoods, trying to further their individual families. And there was no kind of idea that you were in this cohesive gang, this group that was out to achieve certain missions, just like there was no idea of that in the police department or in the military. Now, higher ups wrote a bunch of things, and higher ups in the Bloods and the Crips, they wrote a bunch of things that were rules and things you were supposed to go by. But none of that actually transcends on the individual level. It's like you say about war all the time. If you know anybody that's been to combat, they weren't fighting for America. They were fighting for the friend next to them. They may have gotten into this thing with a naive view of what their organization participation was going to be in, but it ended up being just about protecting your friend and protecting your family that's next to you. And I didn't see that distinction very much within the people we were labeling gangs. It just seemed to be more of a side, whether you were a cowboy or an Indian, so to say, and the perspective was the only difference.
Yeah, and my own experience, I would say from grade 1 to 8, in my community, I lived in a community that was kind of had this ingrained subculture of violence and this ingrained idea of masculinity where violence was the primary way for you to find some success in your life, or to feel important, or to feel like somebody. And when the state takes everything out of the communities, right? So those jobs, those working class jobs, these people used to go to, I remember, factories and stuff like that in my neighborhood. And then there was this weird transition, and then, people just hit rock bottom. And then you layer on top of that, the crack epidemic of the 1990s. And it's just like, what are people supposed to do, right? And it's like, growing up as a kid in that community, it's like you develop this sense of like hopelessness, and it's like passed on to you. And yeah, violence becomes a big part of it. And I read a lot of the gang literature, and it's always kind of directed at economics and all of these things. But I would say that stressor comes a bit later. I would say as kids, we were really, really worried about our safety. And this kind of flips this idea of like pointing at these youth as problematic, right? It flips it on it, because this wasn't the case. It wasn't like we woke up and we wanted to be problematic. We woke up and we were trying to survive, right? And when you feel insecure in your home, and then you feel insecure in your community, and then you feel insecure where you can't even travel to another community because you're from a certain neighborhood, this changes how you think of it, right? And then, yeah, you got to build up a character, a person within you to be able to survive that. So I say that to suggest that my trajectory into kind of a street life was really predicated on bullying, understanding the community, that if you're soft, you're going to become a victim the rest of your life. And, I'm a small guy, and I was even smaller as a kid. So, we're talking also about biological factors, I guess, where it's like you're competing with a kid who's 200 pounds that can sit on you and smash your face in. And it's like, how do you survive that? Well, I survive it by getting with 2 or 3 other smaller kids that might be able to take on the bully. So it's like really understanding what's happening in the community, what's happening in our systems that are supposed to make us feel secure and safe, but they're failing. And then it's that failure that pushes youth to join these cohesive groups. And that's kind of was my original trajectory to great country.
Yeah, and I would have to say, weirdly, I don't know which context to really put it in, but one of my tactics, and it's a known tactic, it's not like it's something unusual, but whenever I went to a new area and I had to establish myself, whether it was through promotion or getting shifted over to a new post when I was changing units, I always would find the toughest person. So you're talking about the one that figured out a way to survive the violence of their neighborhood. I would find that person and do everything I can to essentially punk them and intimidate them on the street to send the signal to the rest of the community that there was a bigger bully on the street, not this guy. So it's not like I wasn't doing anything to interrupt that cycle. And the same thing with the jobs that you say come later on. One of the big revelations that made me really question the effectiveness and lead towards all this managerial stuff and pointing at policing through that perspective was watching that the kid who was selling the drugs on the block that I was watching, he was doing it to make money and to make ends meet for like a little brother, or he would have a grandmother, or there was some other way, even if it was just himself, to get picked on for not wearing Nikes and shoes. These things to school, these things happen. And literally what I was doing, after society took all the other legitimate opportunities away, I was there to take his last illegitimate opportunity away. And it very much made me question the effectiveness of the tactic that I was taking.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the formation of the group. I think forms initially as a way to protect yourself against systemic violence and structural violence that's trickling down, but then it's also to protect yourself from all these other kind of alternative marketplaces that are popping up in the community. And I remember growing up, my parents telling me, "Oh, you don't go over there. That's where all the drug dealers are, or don't go to this space or that space." And you kind of groomed at a young age to start thinking that way and navigating the neighborhood, which I find highly problematic because other people who are middle class or upper class don't have to learn that or have to go through that, right? And that has a huge psychological impact on young people living in an unsafe space, in an insecure space, and having to be taught at a young age how to move through it. So that might be a good transition to our next slide. Is so we kind of understand these elements that might push or pull young people towards street organizations, kind of these macro factors, poverty, violence, experience, exposure to violence. But then once you're there, how do these how did these youth groups transition into more hardcore organizations? Or how do you get a young person to actually start engaging in that street life? And this is something that came out of my dissertation, actually. It was a surprise for me, was kind of one of the primary chapters in my dissertation was around this idea of indoctrination, understanding that there was a change in a human being to be able to go from being, little Bobby on the street to now AKA monster, right? So how does one get to that place? And I found a lot of the literature on the military and policing around these ideas of indoctrination and training. And I questioned myself to say, hey, was this something that actually happened to me and my friends? Did we actually go through a kind of indoctrination process? What I found was yes, it absolutely does happen. It doesn't happen as formally as these other institutions, but we also go through something called street indoctrination or street baptism. And what this is used for is to really test your loyalty to the group, but also your willingness to capitulate yourself, to use violence and to take violence, right? You're good to the group if you don't have the capacity and capabilities to survive violence in the streets. So I don't know if you want to speak to that first also, kind of like how you were groomed through the process of becoming a police officer and how that might have changed your identity.
So I think I would probably say that when I first went into the Marine Corps, I would arrogantly think to myself, you people can't indoctrinate me. I can see your game that you're playing. I felt the same thing in the police department training. But what belied that arrogance was the fact that I was culturally indoctrinated into police being the good guy and the answer to everything, right along with the rest of society. When I grew up, I fantasized watching Cops. I always wanted to be a cop. At this moment, I still terribly miss it. The action is something I will always miss. The information and knowing what's going on is something that I will always miss. It's something that it was definitely ingrained into me as part of the environment that I was in and who that made me literally become. And I think that transcends to everyone when a lot of these topics end up being about what I did, but as hard as a pill it is to swallow, and it sounds like me kind of pushing it off sometimes, I get that. I am a product of society's creation. Millions of dollars were invested in me to be a trained killer. Millions of dollars were in TV shows, watching Knight Rider and watching the cops on TV every single day, and movies that throw me into this being the good way to do it. And it's always important to remember that I'm not alone in this by any means. It is someone from your neighborhood, and most likely it could be even the most staunch person that says they want to defund the police and they want to radically change policing and the criminal justice system away from something of violence. But instead, the moment that they're a victim, they instantly call 911 and turn to violence instead of other solutions to their potential problems. So while I will kind of skirt a little personal responsibility there and put it on the rest of everybody else and say that this is our culture to use violence as an answer, and when most people are pushed, they still end up using it regardless of what they preach.
Yeah, and in the military literature, they speak about breaking the individual or breaking the boy into a man kind of situation, and that has really resonated. It's hard to explain to people. I was having this conversation with a colleague the other day, and I don't know whether if I was wrong or right to have this conversation. But I have a colleague who does a lot of work around human trafficking and specifically around females and stuff. And I questioned to understand, to say, like, a lot of the young men that I grew up around, were they human trafficked? Were they trafficked into the street, right? Kind of used and manipulated and sold a kind of ideology live up to and manipulated into working into these drug markets and stuff. So I think that was some of that. But growing up, I think there was a lot of breaking down of the individual. I've always questioned in retrospect, thinking back, like what happened to all the young guys that used to play stick hockey in the street or baseball and all kind of these innocent things that were part of our childhood. But then now we're hanging out on street corners and doing all these sorts of things, right? And part of the way that street organizations prepare young people to get them ready for the streets is to break them down. So violence is the number one aspect of that. And I remember internally to the street organization, people would we used initiation, we used boxing nights, we used doing things like toe to toe. We would have there would be times where the group would jump on one kid just to beat him down to get some sense into him or to break him further into the group. Then there's kind of external stuff to the organization, outside initiation, all that stuff. Then there's also kind of, missions. So these little missions that we go on to communities, to, neighborhood parties or whatever. And there you're testing your mettle, right? It's like, okay, now it's your time. Now it's not the OG in the group. Now it's like, oh, I got a problem with this guy. Now you go take care of it, right? And that might be the first time you've ever laid hands on somebody or they laid hands on you, right? So it's this constant kind of like where I find the military and the police indoctrination is hormone, really fast, right? It's really, the military one's only like 12 weeks or something, right? Ours is almost like months and years. It's like, so imagine the psychological toll that takes on a young person in transforming their identity from Billy or Bob or whatever you want to call them to monster, right? AA, whatever you want to call them. And it's that breakdown, and it's that willingness to take the violence and to use the violence that brings you closer to the group itself. I think probably I would say between grade 7 and grade 11, at least from my standpoint, all I cared about was proving myself to my friends. I didn't even care about my parents at that time. It didn't matter. The streets mattered, and that's all I cared about. So I wanted to have this slide so that everyone can understand that it's like when, especially for practitioners, when you're working with these people, some of them have gone past their identity of what it used to be, and they're now situated in a new identity. And although there's aspects of the old identity that shows itself once in a while, there's a point of no return, at least for me, within that time frame, where you become so numb to life and so numb to violence that it's just part of you, and you don't see yourself as doing something wrong, as something bad. You actually see yourself as just, this is what your life is, and I'm living it. And this is the tension that I have with calling these kids gangs or seeing them through a criminal-oriented lens, because this is absolutely not how we see it in the streets. So, Mike, have a comment before we move on.
No, man, I totally agree with you as far as the concept goes. I don't know where indoctrination begins and where it ends for sure with this loss of personal identity. I would kind of pride myself, again, arrogantly, on this idea that I wasn't corrupted by the Marine Corps. Like, they didn't indoctrinate me. But all of these things are happening in the subconscious. They're in routines. They're in, like what you're saying, promotions and escalations of responsibility that draw and increase and rewards for increased use of violence. And these things draw you in a way that you're completely unaware of. And to think that they couldn't happen to somebody else or to happen to you is probably very naive. That with the right situation and cultural influence, societal influence around you, you can find yourself either killing people overseas for a college education, or you can find yourself in a local organization trying to improve something on a more local level from what you've been surrounded by. And really, what is the key difference between those two things, especially at least from the person's intent? Because the gang comes with this criminal level of intent attached to it, whereas somebody like me would be given these benevolent intent justifications from society. It's kind of like when people are like, "Thank you for your service," and I'm like, "It was voluntary. I signed the contract and wanted to do it. There's nothing to thank me for." I feel like a lot of these things have the reverse, and I'm not going to say, like, I don't want to offend any military people or any cops, and say that there isn't a difference between the two, but that difference is very hard to define, and you're probably getting into emotional attachment versus standing back objectively and trying to see what the human intentions are and what the human influences are, because only thing we can really do is change those incentives and disincentives for that person to not go that way. It's not like there's amount of force or the police can come in and I can force you into this thing. Everything has to be this subconscious process. The same covert incentives and disincentives that got you here are what would be necessary to get you out. It's almost like trying to say, hey, you're go to jail, and things like that are a way of trying to use rational arguments to argue people out of an irrational place to be. Just as much it was irrational for you to be in a gang when you stand back, it was just as irrational for me to join the military when you stand back. But the incentives and disincentives underneath really define how we are and how society sees us very differently.
Yeah, just to give some context to the trap, some use of it, right? It's just, my first year of high school, I had a whole bunch of problems for different reasons. But the one big thing that kind of situated me within the street culture was that I went to school one day and I walked through, a doorway that we had. And I was surrounded by 5 guys and I was basically getting robbed. They wanted to rob me. And I knew just a couple of guys from my neighborhood or whatever, and they pulled a gun on me. And the guy put the gun to my head. So imagine this as a 15-year-old, right? You've gone through hard enough stuff already, but this was kind of like, I'd never experienced this before, like having a real weapon put on my head and somebody having the intent to want to harm me. So what that turned into was kind of a further entrenchment of me being in these situations, because I couldn't go to my parents because my parents we were living in a community that had kind of this ideology of like, you got to go deal with that yourself, right? And all my friends were living in families like, you got to go deal with that yourself. My parents probably, even if I asked, wouldn't know how to deal with it, right? And then on top of it, what do? Right? So, okay, you ask your parents, and the number one thing your parents are going to do, why don't you go tell the police? But we don't have that ethic in our community. Our community is already unsafe, and our community already doesn't trust the police. So where I grew up, we had kind of this code of silence, this code of the streets that existed, right? It's like, you don't tell, you don't snitch, right? Kind of these ideas of masculinities are pushing down on you to cope and deal with these. And then we've learned historically, when you do tell, that it's all BS. It's all BS at the end of the day. So everyone's telling us, live in this horrible situation where you're experiencing violence and people are pulling guns on you, right? And the normal society is going to say, well, here's these beautiful people, that's the police. Go tell them, they're going to take care of everything. But historically, anytime we told the police, we get arrested. Or we become part of the investigation, right? We're never saved. So when you grow up in that, you just give up, and then the only person you could depend on is yourself, or the man next to you. So your crew becomes that even more important in those situations. And that one circumstance changed the trajectory of my whole life, because that's when I started to realize my life is truly at risk, and these individuals threaten my life, they threaten my family's life, right? Just because of the neighborhood I came from, the people I was surrounded by, or the flag that I flew, which was Bloods at the time, right? So then you wake up every day and you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? I can't go to school, but my mom's forcing me to go to school. And then I go to school, I'm getting into all kinds of fights, so I'm getting kicked out of school. And then she's giving me crap for getting kicked out of school. But now I'm walking around my neighborhood, now I have these big men that are saying they want to kill me. So what's the next thing? So I get a gun. Or I get a neighborhood gun and I borrow it and I start walking with the neighborhood gun, right? And then that gives you a sense of power, and that changes your identity even more. But then sooner or later, those things catch up and you get caught. And that's when you're introduced to the criminal justice system. And I just find that it's kind of this domino effect, and you just keep falling deeper and deeper and deeper. But on the face of it, people will say, oh, you're a criminal for carrying a gun. But they don't know that whole backstory. Like, how are you really supposed to survive that situation? Am I supposed to end up dead? Is that what would make everybody happy? Right? So, I digress.
Well, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I argue a lot about separating violence and aggression. I argue that in my current work that violence is a biological malfunction and aggression is something that is a logical response to something. I have to say that I think it's very hard to find a perspective where if people are after you and you need to defend yourself, I mean, that's why it's codified in law in certain areas, like stand your ground and things like that. You have a right to defend yourself and to your own life. So that I call aggression. If someone's trying to hurt you and you hurt them before they can kill you, that is just not blind, uncontrolled violence that we don't have a societal answer for. That is like a situation where you're trying to save yourself. So is saving yourself something we can actually criminalize?
We had these pictures of ourselves, and this is kind of like after I went through my indoctrination and I was transformed into the streets. And at this time, it was kind of we had a street crew, but we were involved in the hip hop community, so we were involved in music and rap, and we were doing our thing there, and that's why the left-hand picture looks so much more impressive, I guess. And then Michael, these are pictures of yourself and in your transformation, right?
Yeah, and I love always looking at, I mean, like this is the thing where you stand back and you change the perspective. If we had a bunch of my other Marines there and we all do that same pose, which you'll see on the internet 1,000 people do, what is the difference? I mean, the difference is definitely the label and perspective we're applying from the outside. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to get past that to move on to solutions, because this is going to break parts of our identity that you view gang members as something to stop, and to fight is something we can all ingrain to us when we want to make better societies.
Right. And then, like I said, as we're being groomed and we're being introduced into the streets, and you become that much more deeper into it, you become part of this bigger system, this thing that we call the game. This is kind of where Michael and I kind of probably hit heads when he was in his career and I would be in the streets, right? And it's like you're playing this political game and you feel it and you know it, but it's just, we call it the fast life for a reason. It's just like you're waking up every day and you're just living in this space, this kind of underground marketplace, this world that other people don't necessarily have to live, but you're living in. You're just in a survival mode constantly. And the game itself is the reason why young people in the community hate the police. Like, I literally hated you, bro. Like, there is no doubt in my mind, every single person that I grew up around hated you. Well, not you personally, but your gang. We hated your gang.
Yeah, that's always funny. I mean, one thing that's in Baltimore is a big concept is we say that we're the biggest gang in Baltimore, hands down, the only gang that out here wears blue. And that held very true for our environment. And I think it's important for other jurisdictions that are exploring these topics to realize that a lot of these areas where you're talking about and getting data from, all of this information is everything done wrong. That's why these places are in the bad situation. So these are lessons about what not to do, more so than they are about lessons of what to do. And harken back to your point about the game, I lived for the game, and this is part of why I think I strongly believe that people like Adam are like inside much better people than I am, because I miss the game terribly. I love the chase. And coming to work every day, and it was so much of a game, literally, that I had no animosity towards the other gang members. It was that this was the game and we were coming to play it tomorrow. The last thing I wanted to do was hurt you. Then we wouldn't be able to play this game tomorrow. And that's just like a whole nother level of psychological torture, that you're always going to have this thing coming down on you, that the state is going to pay people that enjoy playing this game with you.
Absolutely. And you know, growing up in the communities I grew up in, it was like, you're living in this space and you're being criminalized for the things that you're doing, right? Like, the state's criminalizing the community, they're criminalizing you. You see this history of police coming into the community, kicking down doors. It becomes your badge of honor to go through the criminal justice system instead of the education system, right? And it becomes this kind of cultural component where the system has created this blueprint within this community, where it's us versus you versus us. But the markets that are created, whether they're drug markets or the sex trade or whatever it is, these are markets that exist because there's literally nothing else in that community that can sustain it. And I do want to just preface to say, like, the majority of people who live in marginalized communities go to work and they work hard and do all these things, but they themselves also participate in the alternative marketplace, right? Like my father, my uncles, all these people, they were, but at nighttime they were in the dive bars and they were doing their little drug deals on the side or whatever. So even those best intentioned people live within that community, within that space, and indulged in vices. And the difference is that our space, our community is criminalized for indulging in those vices, where other communities that I went to and I experienced in middle class communities and upper class communities, in those communities, they get to do it and the police don't knock on their door, right? So I think that's a huge part of the difference. And in playing this game, it's an unfair game, right? We only have so much resources to survive and to sustain ourselves, right? Where the police department operates on a $1 billion or more than $1 billion budget to be able to squish us like cockroaches, right? And you know, I've experienced, like, you know, my crew, my group, multicultural gang, whatever you want to call it. So we had youth who were black, Latino, white, you name it, we had it. But what I did was kind of the over policing of these individuals, the police playing the game. So when you're on probation or parole, they'll wait outside your house. Like, I literally had a friend who walked from his property to the park across the street, and he broke his probation and they arrested him. Like, this is just a disaster. So like, you're just constantly putting this person into jail or prison and causing them more psychological harm, causing them to hate themselves even more, causing them to hate the community even more, right? And this is something I can never understand. You know, I was kidnapped by the police. Again, it goes back to feeling safe and secure in the community. Many of the people I grew up with were kidnapped by the police. We were taken to a place in Toronto called Cherry Beach, and they would lay beatings on us. They would take our shoes in the winter. They would take our coats in the winter. They would just leave us in other gang territories, right? Street other turfs, right? On purpose. And so what does this say about the system? Like, you're living in the neighborhood and you're already at the point where you're like, F life. You're already at a point where you're like suicidal, right? You wouldn't be walking this line in life if you didn't have a little suicide in you, because you gave up. Right. And now with the state on top of it, it's like, I'm always baffled. I don't know more people who either killed people or killed themselves. But this speaks to the resiliency of the neighborhood and those in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I was always impressed by that too. I thought that I would have, in those shoes, gone crazy. I would have turned extremely violent and kind of lost it in the stressors that take place in all these neighborhoods. And like you were saying, how it plays in. But for a discussion point, I want to point out that what we're talking about here is really the double victim of the innocent person. There are communities that perpetrate a lot more violence than other ones. And what we have established pretty much worldwide is that police respond to violence. In the media, we will pretend that they respond to demographics, and that's a nonsense argument. they respond to violence. And what that means is that individuals who are paid to do a job, such as arrest people and write tickets and things like that, they are assigned to the areas where there are violence. And then police can only do and go against what they can see, and they can only do it in the areas that they are placed into by other people. And thus, this is why over-policing creates a double victim. They're victim to the violence of these neighborhoods, and then they're victim to the societal response of violence to violence. And it's almost like fighting fire with fire just has to really have a different perspective. I will think that there are times when fire has to be fought with fire, but these are extremely rare situations of exigent situations.
Yeah, and also in my experience, and even in the research, is the majority of these youth are not causing lethal violence. They're actually engaged in a lot of, posturing, non-lethal stuff, maybe threats. But we're still talking about a very small percentage of people who do the biggest amount of harm, right, in the community. But I also think about like the bigger context of the game. The game is really intrinsically linked to the criminal justice system, right? And it's like I said, like you're thrown into the justice system with no choice, and you're almost like it could almost be written into your birth certificate that this is what you're going to end up with, because the system is so strong in these communities in its ability to pull these young people into its arms, right? And I can tell you, out of the 30, 40 people I grew up with who were part of my organization, I'm the only one who made it to a academic career. The rest of these individuals, I have friends who've committed homicide. I have friends who committed homicide, which I believe was out of hopelessness. They've committed suicide. They have substance abuse issues. They have serious mental health issues. And these are individuals who are now in their late 30s, early 40s. And I speak with them, and I think about their lives, and I can guarantee you, we can trace this back to their first contact with the criminal justice system. Like the justice system just destroys you. It just, the labeling, the processing, the first time you go to the Don jail, the first time you have to be in the jail with big men, like all of these things are just like debilitating for these young people. Right?
Join us for the question and answer session in part 2 of this video, links below, and do not forget to subscribe. Join us for the question and answer session in part 2 of this video, links below, and do not forget to subscribe.